As an employee of Greenville County Schools, you are considered a mandated reporter and must report any suspected child abuse you encounter. The goals of this training are to provide a definition of child abuse and neglect, identify the types of abuse and neglect, recognize who is responsible for reporting child abuse and neglect, explain how district employees should report child abuse and neglect, and to examine the penalties for failing to report and immunity for good faith reporting. Abuse occurs when a person responsible for a child's welfare inflicts or allows to be inflicted upon the child permanent or temporary damage, disfigurement, or impairment to a child's body, including injury sustained as a result of excessive corporal punishment. Neglect occurs when a parent or responsible caretaker fails to provide a child with adequate food, clothing, shelter, age-appropriate supervision, or medical care and attention. Neglect may include significantly delaying the provision of these necessities, such as failing to obtain medical treatment for a child who has a broken bone. Other forms of neglect include placing a child at risk of harm or exposing a child to hazardous living conditions. This list provides the various types of abuse and neglect that must be reported by district employees: physical abuse, physical neglect, sexual abuse, medical neglect, mental abuse or injury, abandonment, encouraging delinquency, exposure to domestic violence, educational neglect. Some of the possible signs of physical abuse are unexplained marks or injuries on the body, such as bruises, cuts, welts, burns, black eyes, fractures, or dislocations. Bruises or welts in various stages of healing, or in clusters or patterns in the shape of an object like a belt or an electrical cord. Pattern burns such as cigarette burns, iron burns, burns in the shape of a specific object, or scald burns in an immersion pattern. Or marks hidden from typical exposed skin. Some children may show more subtle indicators of abuse through behavioral changes, such as extreme vigilance and watchfulness, or extreme fear of parents, caregivers, or fear of going home. Some signs that may indicate neglect include often being hungry in the morning, extreme poor hygiene, evidence of no or poor supervision, underweight, poor growth, or failure to thrive, dressed inappropriately for the weather, and erratic attendance at school. Some of the possible signs of sexual abuse are sexual knowledge beyond what is age-appropriate, recurring pain or itching in genital or anal areas, sexually transmitted diseases, frequent bladder or urinary tract infections, genital injury, and sexually acting out behavior. Be aware that sexual predators often abuse children in ways that do not leave physical signs, such as fondling the child, exposing themselves to the child, or having the child perform sexual acts on the adult. Even sexual penetration of a child does not always leave obvious physical signs of abuse. Mandated reporters are individuals who frequently work with children and are often the first adults to see signs of child abuse or neglect. South Carolina law requires all mandated reporters to report if they have reasonable cause to believe that a child may be abused or neglected. This list shows some of the professions identified as mandated reporters by South Carolina law. While the law identifies certain professions as mandated reporters, you should be aware that school district policy considers all employees to be mandated reporters. It is your obligation to report your suspicions of child abuse or neglect and document it on the Suspected Child Abuse Neglect form. Remember, any doubt about reporting should be resolved in favor of protecting the child. When a child discloses abuse or neglect, it can be stressful, not only for the child, but also for you, the person hearing about it. Listen attentively. Be aware of your facial expressions and body language. Try to maintain a calm expression, and do not express doubt, disbelief, anger, or shock. Come down to the child's level. when you're talking to him or her. Ask basic questions like, what happened? Who did it? Where and when did it happen? Never put words in a child's mouth, and avoid leading questions or probing for details. For example, if a child says, "My dad hurt me," do not ask, "Did your dad touch you in your private part?" Instead ask, "How did your dad hurt you?" It is important to limit the number of times a child is questioned or interviewed about an abuse or neglect incident. Multiple interviews can traumatize the child, and if not done appropriately, may have a negative impact on the investigation. Remember that it is your duty to report your suspicions and not to investigate what a child has told you. Leave the investigation to a trained professional. Do not remove the child's clothing. Thank the child for disclosing, and do not give false assurances that information will be kept confidential. Report as soon as possible when information has been obtained, and document that a report was made on the suspected child abuse and neglect form. When making a report, it will be helpful to have the following information: the name of the child's age and date of birth, the address where the child resides, the present location of the child, the parents' names and address, the names and ages of any siblings, the alleged perpetrator's name, the reasons for making the report, and any known history of violence in the home. When documenting the information you receive related to abuse or neglect of a child, document the basis for your concern, including the physical and behavioral signs and statements made. If the child made a statement to you, use the child's exact words. Also, record the child's demeanor with specific observations. Record the date, time, and agency individual with whom you spoke. Once you have completed the suspected child abuse neglect form, give the original to the principal to be filed. This form shall not be distributed or shown to anyone other than DSS, law enforcement, and the principal. The report is not considered a part of the student's educational record and is not subject to disclosure. It should not be placed in the student's permanent record. Moreover, records and notes maintained by a teacher, administrator, nurse, social worker, or school psychologist for his or her own use, and which are not available to others, are exempted from this definition of school records. When you are ready to make a report, make a verbal report to the Department of Social Services or to appropriate law enforcement agencies having jurisdiction over where the alleged abuse or neglect occurred. Call as soon as possible. Remember to complete the suspected child abuse neglect form. This form may be found on the Google Drive and the Social Work Department website. You will need to fax the form to DSS. You must also notify the principal or your immediate supervisor of the report as soon as possible and give the original form to the principal to be kept on file. You should call law enforcement when a child reports sexual abuse, physical abuse, or when a child feels that he or she is in danger or will feel unsafe if sent home. Law enforcement will notify DSS after they have received a report. If there are concerns by the school's administration about dismissing a child from school and sending the child into an unsafe environment, law enforcement should be contacted immediately. The student should remain at school until law enforcement provides further direction. You should call DSS when there are suspicions of physical neglect, medical neglect, educational neglect, or inadequate food, clothing, shelter, and/or supervision. You should also call DSS if the child reports illegal drug usage in the home. Both DSS and law enforcement have 24-hour coverage 7 days a week. Remember that if you are contacting law enforcement, you will need to contact the agency having jurisdiction over where the alleged abuse or neglect occurred. When making a report, use specific terms in describing the alleged abuse or neglect. If the abuse or neglect was allegedly committed by the parent, guardian, or other family member, do not contact the child's parents or guardian, as doing so may interfere with the investigation. law enforcement or DSS will contact the parent or guardian. You may have questions about the process DSS uses to decide if a report should be taken or not. DSS will screen reports to determine if appropriate for investigation. If accepted for investigation, DSS must begin an investigation within 24 hours. DSS may also screen some reports out, but will still document that a report was made. If you are at the school when DSS arrives to investigate, remember that DSS may interview a student outside the presence of the parents on school premises. DSS does not need to have parental permission to interview the child in an investigation. If DSS considers a report to be low to moderate risk, the case may be diverted to Specialized Alternatives for Families and Youth, or SAFI. If the case is diverted to SAFI, a SAFI worker will contact the family within 5 days. SAFI does not investigate, but will assess the situation and help the family locate services to reduce risk to the child. SAFI may come to the school to see the child, but must have a signed parental consent form. You should be aware that neither DSS nor SAFI may have access to school records for a child without a signed release from a parent, guardian, or a court order. When making a report, these are some things you should remember. Identify yourself as a mandated reporter if you would like for DSS to call back to inform you if the case was accepted for investigation or not. Under South Carolina law, names of reporters are kept confidential. DSS and law enforcement may not release the reporter's name. However, they may share the name of the reporter with each other to further their investigation. DSS cannot reveal the reporter's name to SAFI. Furthermore, district employees may not reveal the identity of the person making a report to the person suspected of the abuse or neglect. You may have concerns about what will happen if your report turns out not to be abuse or neglect. Under South Carolina Code 63-7-390, if you are a mandated reporter and made that report in good faith, meaning that you had reasonable cause to believe that abuse or neglect occurred, you are protected by law from civil and criminal liability. Informing your supervisor or anyone else does not fulfill your legal obligation to report as a mandated reporter. You must ensure that the report is made. Your supervisor cannot restrict you from making a report, nor take negative actions against you for making a report. According to South Carolina Code 63-7-410, mandated reporters who fail to report suspected abuse or neglect can be charged with a misdemeanor and subject to a fine of up to $500 or imprisonment for up to 6 months. Failure to report suspected abuse or neglect can also result in termination, suspension, or demotion. It can also result in the loss of a professional license and damage to professional reputation. There is also the possibility of civil liability and lawsuits. Mandated reporters should never assume that another professional has already reported the situation. It is your responsibility to call and report what you know about the situation. Even if a report has already been made, your information may still be valuable, as it could help the investigator in deciding whether to indicate the report. If you are unsure if a situation should be reported, you should make the report. Any doubt should be resolved in favor of protecting the child. Remember, as a Greenville County Schools employee, you are mandated by district policy to report. Early detection and intervention may prevent further abuse, neglect, and possibly even death. If you have questions about making a report, you may call the Social Work Services Department and speak with someone for assistance. This Greenville County Schools video was produced in collaboration with law enforcement, DSS, and the Greenville Health System to better educate you on what it means to be a mandated reporter.